And welcome back to the Basics of Biblical Hebrew series here with Louis Dizon. We are continuing the series with lecture 14. But first, welcome back to the show, Louis. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing quite well. It's been, fairly hectic week for me, so feeling a little bit tired, but just still got enough energy to do these, thankfully.
hmm hmm Yeah, I imagine it takes a little bit of preparation, so it takes it out of you.
Yeah, yeah. Like relative to some of the other stuff that I do for this show, the Hebrew ones are less preparation intensive.
hmm
Like most of it consists of reading through the relevant chapter beforehand and seeing if there are any relevant extra examples that I can find of like the grammar object being discussed outside of the textbook itself. Um, so, you know, um,
Not too bad
it's
then.
yeah, like I'm gonna do some stuff on like Islamic studies fairly soon
hmm
for this show, and those actually require a lot of preparation.
Oh, I can
Um,
imagine. Yeah.
yeah, especially because you consider, like it's going to be no doubt a lot of Muslims are going to see those, and
Mhm.
they're going to critique every point I make, so I need to
Oh,
make
yeah.
sure that everything is like
Cro-
airtight. Yeah,
Cross the T's, dot the I's. They'll look for
yeah,
something
yeah,
there to criticize. I hear you. Well, go
yeah.
ahead and tell us what we have today in store.
Well, we've covered everything pertaining to the call stem. Um, you may remember the past several lessons have been related to this that the call, which is the simplest of the verb stems. Um, and the way it's taught in most Hebrew grammars is you spend most of your time with that one stem because it forms the basis for all the other stems. So now we're going to talk about the Niphal, which is the stem that is used to convey passive and reflexive verbs. So here, I got the verbum up so we can begin the lesson. Before I do, though, I want to make an addendum to the previous lesson. When we were talking about vav consecutives, I mentioned that sometimes, even though the vaiktol usually means a past action and the vakatal usually means a present action, that doesn't always apply. And I meant to look for an example of that, but I couldn't find it last time. But I found the example I had in mind, and it's actually in um, Isaiah chapter 9. So this is the famous passage that talks about, a son will be born to us, a child will be born to us, a son will be given. It's worth looking at the verse in Hebrew. So on the left hand side of the screen, I have the verse up, and it says, Ki yeled yilad lanu benitan lanu, but he hamisra al shichmo, vaikrashmo peleyoetz el gibor aviad sar shalom. I just want to draw your attention to the highlighted verbs vatehi and vaikra. As you can see, these are both vav consecutive imperfects or vaiktols. Um, Normally, if you encounter a vaiktol like this in a narrative, you would understand it as a past action. But as you can see, that's not the case here, because this is not a narrative text. This is a prophetic text. So the vaiktols here are actually future actions. And upon him will be, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and his name will be called. Um, and that's because these are examples of a phenomenon we discussed before called the prophetic perfect, where certain verbs, even if they would normally indicate past action, are phrased in such a way that they're being used to refer to a future event. And the way it's thought of is from the perspective of the prophet giving the prophecy. Um, it's already a done deal, even though it hasn't happened yet. It will happen for sure, and you can speak of it as though it's already happened. So, that's one of those fun grammatical things to make note of when you're reading prophetic texts and you encounter the Vaiktol. to refer to a future event. That is the reason why. With that out of the way, let's start talking about the Niphal stem. So this is the first of the non-call stems that we will be discussing. There are several such stems that we will be discussing over the next several lessons, including the PL, the Pual, the Hitpael, the Hifil, and the Hofal, as well as a few rarer stems that don't belong into those categories. So the Nifal is best described as the verb that expresses either a passive or a reflexive meaning to the call verb. So you take any call verb, you change its stem to a nifal, and that nifal verb is basically going to be the either the passive or the reflexive version of whatever its call equivalent is. So I'll give you an example actually. First, let me switch to the Hebrew Bible insert. Um, so first, let's look at a call verb as our point of reference. In 2 Kings 21:26, it says, Vaikboroto bikvarota, sorry, bikvurato began Uzzah. And he buried him in the cave of the garden of Uzzah. All right, so Ikbor is a kal, so you translate as he buried him. Now contrast that with 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 18. Vaikaber began Beto began Uzzah, and he was buried in the garden of his house, in the garden of Uzzah. So one is akal, yikbor, it's translated as he buried, and then the other is vaikaber, which is the nifal form, and it's translated as he was buried. Um, Apart from the passive, there is also the reflexive meaning, and a reflexive verb is basically a verb where the subject and the object are the same. In other words, the subject is doing the action to itself. Um, and sometimes, um, usually you can tell whether a nifal is being used in a either a passive or a reflexive sense from the context. There are a few cases where you cannot necessarily tell from the context which is being used, and I'll give you an example. All right. So let's go to Genesis chapter 12. All right. Ve avaracha mevarchecha u mekalelcha aor ve nivrachu b'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama. So there are two ways of translating this part. Va nivracho b'cha kol mishpachot. Uh, it's either all the families will be blessed or all the families will bless themselves. So we can see in the English translation here, which is ESV, the primary translation here is the passive. In you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. On the flip side, if you click on the little footnote here, it says that another way to translate this is all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. So you can see, according to the translators, you can understand this as either a passive or a reflexive, and both are valid ways of translating this. Another example would be the Net Bible, where it is translated, all the families of the earth will bless one another. So again, here, the reflexive use of the nifal actually becomes the primary meaning for the translators. Um, Other than that, most other cases, you can easily tell which one is being understood. So um, you can see the little table here. If you see they use the word heard or shama as the example. Um, in the kal would be he heard. In the passive be it was heard, or in the reflexive he heard himself. There's a note here that says stative verbs cannot be converted as there is no action for the subject to receive. That does not mean that a Niphal cannot take on a stative meaning. Um, I will show you some examples later on where, in fact, um, a Niphal can be used with a stative sense. Um, so in most it says here, so in most cases you'll find it easier to decipher the meaning. Yeah, this we just explained that already. Um, so keep in mind that some verbs are reflexive by nature. So there are some verbs that are that they almost always appear in the Nifal. So laham, you know, usually it'll appear in its Nifal form nilham. So the kal form is rarely used. Um, but um, regardless, it would still be translated in English as fight. Now, the same occurs for the word shava, which means to swear an oath. You'll rarely hear the word shava. More often, you will hear its Nifal equivalent nishba. And as it states here, the reflexive sense is what is meant here, which is placing oneself under oath. Um, Now, because of the nature of the Nifal, it does not take a direct object. So in a kal, um, you would have the subject, and you have the verb, and then you have the direct object, which is normally indicated by the marker et. However, because in the Nifal, the subject is the one on which the action is being directed, um, there will be no. So the subject is, in a sense, the object as well, or functioning the way it would function as an object if it was a call. That doesn't mean that the et won't appear. Sometimes they do use the et, but they attach the et to the subject. So the example given here is Exodus 21:28. Valo ye'achel et basaro, and its flesh will not be eaten. So its flesh is the subject, but note that the subject has et attached to it. Um, so the et is there because it is used to indicate that Basaro is receiving the action Ye'achel. Um, Now, aside from the indicative form, there are also the non-indicative uses of the Niphal. So first, there's the imperative. As it states here, because um, because the imperative, passive ideas cannot be commanded. Anytime you run into the Niphal imperative, it is always reflexive um, in nature. Um, if you encounter a Niphal imperative, the general gist of it is the command is do this to yourself. Um, Now, aside from the imperative, you also have all the other forms that we encountered for the kal. There are the jossives, the cohortatives, the participles, etc. And as you'll see, it's fairly easy to determine what those will look like. First, we have to know what the basic form of the kal is. So here we have a table on the screen on how to create a Niphal strong verb paradigm. Um, Once you've learned all the forms for the call stem, you've already done majority of the memorization work for verbs, because when it comes to the other stems, they basically are variations of those same tables. You just need to memorize four forms here. So they're shown here. You have the infinitive construct, which is represented by hikatel, the infinitive absolute, which is either niktol or hikatol. Notice that in both that the cholem always appears above the second um, root. You have for the perfect form, it's niktal, And then the participle is niktal with a kamet instead of a patach. From these forms, you can pretty much infer all of the other forms of the Niphal. For example, the perfect form, niktal, from there, you have forms like niktla, niktalu, um, niktalnu, etc., which you'll recognize has the same suffirmatives as the kal. Similarly, with the participle niktal, you can infer from this that the other forms of the participle would be niktalim, niktala, and niktalot. Um, Now, as for the imperfect form, as we'll see shortly, that depends on your knowledge of the infinitive. So, skip that, I already explained it. Um, so, the infinitive construct is used to produce most of those other conjugations that I just mentioned. The first one, for our purposes, is the imperfect form. So, remember, the infinitive construct for our purposes is going to be hikatel. Basically, what you would do with an imperfect is you take out the he, the hirek he at the beginning, and you replace it with the preformatives. Um, so the third person masculine singular would be yikatel. The feminine version would be tikatel. Second masculine singular would be tikatel. First person singular will be ekatel, and so on and so on. And other than that, from the same form, you can infer what the jussive and the cohortative is. If you remember, for the call stem, the jussive and cohortative is in most cases the same as the imperfect. The main place where it will be different will be in the first person singular and plural. So this first person singular imperfect for Niphal is ekatel, whereas the whereas the cohortative is going to be ektala. Ek, sorry, not ektala, ekatla, ekatla. Um, and then the imperative form. So you remember that the imperative is formed by taking um, the uh, what you call it, the infinitive construct, and then um, taking out the first radical here. Sorry, not the radical, the preformative here. Actually, no, uh, that's wrong. Forget I said that. Um, let's say. Actually, yeah, it more or less looks the same as the infinitive construct. What was I thinking about? Something different. So as you can see here, the infinitive primary imperative form is hikatel. It is identical to the infinitive construct. If they're identical, how do you tell them apart? Simple answer: context. Anytime two forms look identical, um, you have trouble telling them apart, use context. And then from hikatel, you can infer all the other forms of the imperative, such as hikatli and hikatlu. Um, so the the way that you can identify a Niphal is through the nun that's attached in the beginning, but as you can see, the nun oftentimes drops out. But when it drops out, it still leaves evidence of its presence. And how it does that is through the dagesh forte. So here you can see in the imperfect forms for tikatel and tikatli that there's a dagesh on the tav. That dagesh is there to tell you that um, there was originally a nun there and got assimilated into the performative. Now, then you have the Niphal absolute, which is the other major form. So, as I already mentioned, the way you tell that something is an infinitive absolute is is that there's the presence of the cholem over the second radical. So hikatol or niktol. You may recall its kal equivalent is katol. So the main difference is that there is this, the he, hirek he, the he hirek. or in this case, the Nun Hirik. Um, and then the participles, fairly simple and straightforward. Niktal, Niktla, Niktalta. Sorry, no, that's the perfect form. Niktal, Niktala, Niktalim, Niktalot. So, so here are all, these are, if you have the textbook, all the tables you need to memorize are there. Um, and you can see that, the main difference is that there's the noon with the hirik for here, but otherwise it's very similar in structure to the kal. That's why you use the kal as the template. If you have not memorized all of those tables that we went over in the past several lessons, now is a good time to do that because you're gonna need those. Um, Now let's take a look at some more examples of the Niphal. So let's switch to the Hebrew Bible insert. Um, uh, the one of the things I don't like about the grammar that we're using is they don't have a lot of examples. So I'm using the Hebrew Bible insert to give you examples that actually occur in the Bible. So we read a bunch of Bible verses that have Niphals in them. So we've already read the first one. So let's look at some others. So here are some places where the Niphal is being used passively. First, you have Genesis 4, verse 18. Vayvaled lachanoch et Irad. Um, and born to Enoch was Irad. So you can see this is the Niphal form of the verb yalad, to bear. In Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 22, Vaiftach et pi, Vaipatach pi. So he opened my mouth, and my mouth was opened. So here you have both the kal and the Niphal form of patach in the same verb. Sorry, in the same sentence rather. You know, that way you can actually see them side by side and tell the difference between them. Ruth chapter 2 verse 6. Hana'ar hanitzav al hakotzrim. So here you have an example of a Niphal participle. The young man, the one who was stationed over the reapers or the ones reaping. So you can tell the difference between a kal participle and a Niphal participle. Here, a kotzer is a kal participle. Here, nitzav is a Niphal participle. Both are being used substantively, as you can see. Other than that, here is what I mentioned earlier about how some Niphals function as stative adjectives or gerundives. So we'll see how they look and how to translate them. Genesis 34, verse 19. Vehu nikbad mikol bet aviv. And he was more honorable than the house of his father. Oh, sorry, than all of the house of his father. Notice that the mem here is being used in the comparative sense, like sometimes the min here shows that a point of comparison between he who and kol bet aviv. And notice nikbad, that's the Niphal form of kabed, a stative verb meaning to be heavy or to be honored. Here it has the sense of he was honored or he was held as honorable. And then in Joel chapter 2, verse 11, Gadol Yom Adonai Venora Meod. Great is the day of Adonai, and very, very much to be feared, or very fearsome. So you can see that the verb for to fear is appearing here in the Niphal form, and it's being used in a stative sense. Now, how about some reflexive uses of the Niphal? Here are some examples of that. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 10, Vanishmarta Mikol Davar Ra, and you shall keep yourselves from all the word of evil, from every evil word, rather, for every evil thing. Davar can mean either word or thing, depending on context. I think thing is what is actually meant here. Um, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 5. Vanistarti basade, and I will hide myself in the field. So he is concealing himself. Uh, Satar is the call form of this, means to hide. And then um, here in Ruth chapter 3, verse 3, Al tivad I laish. Uh, do not reveal yourself to a man, to the man rather. Um, Notice that this is actually the Niphal form of yada, um, to know. So in the Niphal form, it means to make yourself known. Um, and here it's being, it's in the um, what you call second person feminine singular. Um, and then there's the middle use of the Niphal. What that means is the subject is doing something on its own behalf. And this one, it says it's difficult to distinguish. Um, so sometimes you have to think about some of the other possible meanings. So Genesis chapter 7, um, verse 11 actually has two of these. Niv ka'u kol ma'yonot tahom rabba ve'arubot hashemayim niftahu. And all the springs of the deep burst. So baka, this the call form is baka. The Niphal form is uh, to mean like to burst. Here it's it's basically to burst oneself. And then the windows of heaven open themselves. There is also two more uses of the Niphal that we need to make note of here. There's what you call the reciprocal use of the Niphal, which is the subject participates in an action with someone else. So, you have a group of people or group doing the same action, and the subject is included in there. And one of the examples is in Judges chapter 16, verse 23. Basarne plishtim neesfu lisboach. Now the lords of the Philippines, sorry, Philistines had gathered to sacrifice, um, as it says here. I don't know why I said Philippines. So neesfu, this is the Niphal form of the verb asaf, to add or to gather. And then Judges chapter 11, verse 5. Vahi kaasher nilchamu bnei Ammon im Yisrael. And so it was, just as um, the sons of Ammon fought with Israel. So here is that Niphal form of milcham that was mentioned in the textbook earlier. So when you're translating it to English, it's not immediately obvious that you have a Niphal in view. When you see it in the Hebrew, then it suddenly makes sense why the Niphal is being used there. And then finally, there's a tolerative use of the Niphal, which is the subject allows something to happen or to be done to him or herself. And these, as it states here, appear to be passive, but they are not the same as the passive use of the Niphal. Genesis chapter 25, verse 21 is an example. Vayetar Yitzchak Ladonai, Vayeater lo Adonai. So Isaac prayed to Adonai. Note that Ya'ater is actually a PL, which is one of the stems we haven't learned yet, but we will next time, Lord willing. And then the Niphal form of the same verb appears, and Adonai allowed himself to be prayed to by him. Um, like you could understand this in a passive way. You could translate it as and Adonai was entreated by him. This is why the two tend to blend together. You could translate it either way. Um, Another example is Proverbs chapter 29, verse 19. Bidvarim lo yevaser aved ki yavin ve'en ma'aneh. So, in words, the servant does not allow to be corrected, does not is not corrected by, or does not allow himself to be corrected by. Once again, note that um, the Niphal here could be translated in a passive sense. The servant is not corrected by words, but contextually it would make more sense to use, a tolerative understanding. Does not allow himself to be corrected. Ki avin ve'en ma'aneh, for he understands and there is no answer. So far, so good. So, you know, as you can see, the Niphal is a fairly straightforward um, stem to learn once you get a hang of all the possible meanings, of which here there are four. And of those, actually, why does it say four? No, it's more than four. There are six. Um, but the two that are most often associated will be the reflexive and the passive. So keep it in the back of your head that there are other uses of the Niphal besides the passive and the reflexive, but just remember that vast majority of the time when you run into a Niphal, these are the two uses that are in view. So, with that being said, we can actually, before we go to the translation, there's actually a complete verb chart at the end of the textbook, exercise for chapter 18. Take a note of this Niphal verb chart. This is, these are all the forms of the Niphal, of which you need to memorize these forms. And then once you memorize them, you can infer all these other forms from them. If you wanted to, you can memorize this entire table, but it would be very tedious and unnecessary. Um, Knowing the basic forms will help simplify the process. And then once you have gotten the hang of it, always remember in the workbook that accompanies the textbook, there are blank tables that you can use to practice filling out the different verb forms. So here's the one for exercise 18, for chapter 18. And then once you start learning the Nif, the PL, the Pual, the Hitpael, here are some of the other forms that you can fill out. So yeah, always remember, watching these videos is only 10% of the language learning. The other 90% is going through the workbook, doing the exercises, and the translation work. And when you do that, you internalize the language. So let's go to chapter 40, chapter 17, Genesis 45. Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Um, so you remember the cliffhanger from our last translation exercise. Joseph had framed his younger brother Benjamin by placing his cup in his sack, and this is part of the ruse to eventually um, reveal himself to his brothers. And here is where he does that. Always remember that when we're doing these exercises, the text that we're using is not the complete text of Genesis. It's a simplified version thereof. If you want to see a comparison, on the left hand side is the complete unabridged text of Genesis 45. And here is the one we're translating, which is a simplified version thereof. That takes out some of the other forms, such as the hitpael, that we haven't learned yet. Note that as we learn more verbal forms, um, the exercise chapters become less simplified, and eventually they just give you the complete chapter as it stands. Also note that for this particular um, exercise, the chapter is formatted a little differently, and that's because they are diagramming it. So diagramming is an exercise, is something that some language courses will teach you to do. So actually, if you look at the textbook, there's an appendix called How to Create a Grammatical Diagram. And it just shows you the basics of how to split a verse apart into its constituent clauses and to determine how each clause relates to all the other clauses within the same verse. Um, it is outside of the scope of these lessons to teach you how to create a grammatical diagram, but it is a skill that I highly recommend because it helps you to understand the flow of the text and thus facilitates more accurate exegesis. Fortunately, we don't have to diagram Genesis 45. It's already been done for us. As it says here, the main clauses are on the far right hand side. And then whenever a clause is indented, such as this one, that means it is a subordinate clause. And they're placed under the verb that they modify. And here you can see emor, lahem, etc., is under amad, showing that it's modifying that verb amad. And then, whenever a character is speaking, it's placed in a box like this. And this will help you understand the flow better. But, for now, we're just going to translate the text. And the first few verbs I'm going to parse, but I'm not going to do that for all of the verbs. Note that because this is for the chapter before the one we had just done here, the Niphal does not appear here yet. So all the verbs will be in the kal. Verse 1. Vayhi Yosef holek livkot vaika. Shilcha ki ish me'alai. So that's the first half of the verse. And so it was, Yosef went to weep, and he said, send all the men from before me. So Vaihi is the Vaiktol form of Haya. It's the third person masculine singular. Holech is a participle, masculine singular of halach, to walk or to go. Livchot is the infinitive construct form of baka, which means to weep. Vaikra is the Vaiktol form of kara, which is to call or to say. And it's the third person masculine singular. Shilchu is an imperative. So shalach is to send. Shilchu is the imperative masculine plural form of shalach. Then the second half of the verse, Velo amad ish ito be'emor lahem ki hu Yosef achihem. And and did and no man stood with him when he said to them, for he is Joseph their brother. So you have the verb amad here. which is the basic form, third person masculine singular, to stand, and none stood, basically. Verse 2. Vaiten et kolo bivki vayishma'u Mitzrayim vayishma bet paro. And he gave his voice um, in weeping, um, and Egypt heard, or rather, the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. So, Vaiten is the Vaiktol form, third person masculine singular. Bibki is Baka. Um, it's a form of Baka. This is also um, an infinitive construct, I believe. And then Yishma'u and Yishma are both Vaiktol forms of Shema. The difference is that this is third person masculine plural, and this is third person masculine singular. And then for the rest, I'm just going to translate without parsing. Vayomer Yosef el Echav. Ani Yosef ba'od avichai. Notice that this is Joseph speaking. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? Or is my father still alive? And then the second half, verse 3. Vayolach lu echav l'anot oto ki yar'u mipanav. And his brothers were not able to answer him because they feared him, or they were afraid before him, if you want to translate it literally. Verse 4. Vayomer Yosef el Echav, Kirbuna Elai, Vaikravu. So, sorry, I misspoke. Kivru is to bury, but Joseph isn't asking to be buried here. Kirvu is come close to me. And Joseph said to his brothers, come close, please, to me. And they came close. And then the second half. Vayomer, ani Yosef achichem, asher makartem oti Mitzrayma. And he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold, from Machar, whom you sold me towards Egypt. Sometimes note that the definite direct object marker is placed in contexts where you would not translate it in English. If you're translating this, you would not include this in your translation. You just say, whom you sold to Egypt. Here you have subordinate clauses one after the other. Verse 5. And by the way, note that this is all Joseph speaking right up to verse 9. So verse 5. Ve'ata al tira'u va'al yichar be'enechem ki makatem oti henna ki lemichya shalach oti Elohim lifnechem. And now do not be afraid, and do not be mad in your eyes, or in other words, do not be mad at yourselves, for you sold me here. For making alive, or to preserve life, he sent me, or as God sent me before you. So there's a theological affirmation here that even though his brothers were the ones who sent him, in reality it was God behind the scenes who made Joseph to be sent to Egypt. So God's providence is at work in all the events that have taken place. Very rich theology. And it becomes richer when you're able to read it in Hebrew. Verse 6. Kize shnataim haraav bekerev haaretz ve'od chamesh shanim asher en charish ve'chatzir. Chatzir, rather. For this is 2 years of the famine in the midst of the land. Or in other words, there's already been a famine for 2 years in the midst of the land, and there are yet 5 years to go of famine, in which There is no plowing and reaping. These are both passive participles. You may note. Um, the verse 7. Vaishlach oto Elohim lifnechem lashum, sorry, lasum lachem she'erit ba'aretz u leman yihyeh lachem pleta gdola. And God sent me before you to place you as a remnant in the land, or a remainder in the land, and so that it will be to you a great surviving. So pleta has to do with like escape or survival. If you want to translate this more idiomatically, it'd be so that a great number of you will be rescued or survive. Verse 8. Ve'ata lo atem shlachtem oti hena ki ha'elohim vayasem oti la'av lefar'o ula'adon lechol beto u moshel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. And now, do you know? Do not send me here. For God, you did not send me here. Um, for God placed me as a father over Pharaoh, as a father to Pharaoh, and as a lord to all his house, and to rule as a participle in all the land of Egypt. So again, the same theological statement we saw 2 verses earlier is repeated. God is the one who sent Joseph here, not his brothers, and it's for the purpose of turning Joseph into a father to Pharaoh, a lord over all his house, and a ruler over all the land of Egypt. Um, Notice the parallelism here. Verse 9. Ve'alu el avi ve'amartem elav. And we'll read the rest later. And so go up to my father and tell him. So he's going to give a command here. Ko Amar bin Yosef. Thus says your son Joseph. Sam oti Elohim la'adon l'chol Mitzrayim reda elai al ta'amod. God placed me as a lord to all Egypt. Go down to me and do not stay. Verse 10. Vayashabta be'eretz Goshen v'haita karov elai ata uvanecha uvnei vanecha v'tzoncha uv'karcha ubecharcha v'chol asher lach. And he will dwell in the land of Goshen. And you will dwell in the land of Goshen. And you will be close to me, you and your sons, and the sons of your sons, and your flocks, and your cattle, and all which is yours. Verse 11. U pakadti otcha sham ki od chamesh shanim ra'av pen ta'avod. Pen tovad ata uvetcha v'chol asher lach. So, and I will take care of you there, or I will attend to you there, for there are still 5 years of famine lest you perish, you and your house and all which is yours. Verse 12. V'hine, enechem ro'ot v'ene achi Binyamin pi ha omer alechem. And behold, your eyes um, have seen, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin, um, like mouth to mouth, which I said to you. So it's sort of like he's seen all the things that I just said to you. Um, and then verse 13, Vadibartem la'avi et kol kvodi b'mitzrayim ve'et kol asher ra'item vayaratem im avi henna. Um, and you will speak to my father all of my glory in Egypt, um, and all which you saw, and you will go down with my father here. So he's sending for his father. And this is the end of the long quote um, that is being attributed to Joseph here. And then verse 14, Vaipol al Tzavre bin Binyamin achiv vayevk ubinyamin baka al Tavarav. And he fell upon the neck um, so of Benjamin his brother, and he wept. So he cried on Benjamin's neck, in other words. And Benjamin, likewise, wept upon his neck. So they're having a brother moment here. Verse 15, Vayishak l'chol echav vayevk alehem ve'acharek hen dibru echav ito. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, and his brothers thus and other and find and afterwards he said to his brothers, he spoke to his brothers thus, or this. um, Verse 16, Uvet paro shama et hakol lemor ba'u ache Yosef vayitav be'ene paro be'ene avadav. And the house of Pharaoh heard the voice saying, Come, brothers of Joseph. So, and it was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants. So he approves of what is happening here. Verse 7, the first half says, Vayomer Paro el Yosef, Emor el achecha. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I say to your brothers, and this is what he says to his brothers in the second half, Zot asu imsu et chamorechem uvo'u atza knaan. This, do this, load your donkeys and go towards the land of Canaan. Verse 18, Uchachu et avichem ve'et batechem uvo'u elai ve'etna lachem et tov eretz Mitzrayim ve'ichlu et chelev haaretz. And take, that's imperative, and take your father and your house, and come to me, and I will give to you the goodness of the land of Egypt, and eat the fat of the land. Verse 19, continuation of the quote. Va'atem zot asu chachu lachem me'eretz Mitzrayim agal agalot latapchem ve'lin shechem u nesatem et avichem u vatem. And you, and you do this: take for yourselves from the land of Egypt young calves, um, letavchem, to sorry, I'm not forgot what this word means. Let me just double check the existing English translation. Um, take wagons for yourselves for your little ones. Okay, sorry about that. Sometimes I forget what some of these vocab words are. Take for yourselves wagons for your children, and for your wives, and um, the wives of your father, and come. And then verse 20. Va'en chem al tachos al klechem ki tov kol eretz Mitzrayim lachem hu. And your eyes do not shall not spare the upon your clay, it's like vessels, something like that. For the goodness of all the land of Egypt is to you, is yours rather. Let's see that translation again. Verse 20. Um, Concern. So, yeah, where is that? Okay, clay means goods in this context. Sometimes that word can be translated like vessels or certain other contexts. So it didn't occur to me that it didn't mean goods here. Don't be concerned about your goods, or do not let your eyes not have pity or have a care for your vessels. Um, Verse 21, Vayasuchen bnei Israel, Vaiten lahem Yosef agalot al pi paro, Vaiten lahem ochel ladarech. And the sons of Israel did thus. And Joseph gave to them wagons upon by the word of Pharaoh, or upon the mouth of Pharaoh. And he gave to them food for the journey, or food for the way. All right, we're getting close. About 7 more verses left. Verse 22. Lekulam matan laish be begadim u levinyamin natan shlosh meot kesef ve chameshet begadim. And to all of them he gave to each man garments, clothing rather. But to Benjamin he gave 300 silver, 300 pieces of silver, and chameshet, 5 garments. So Joseph got 5 times as much as all his other brothers. And then verse 23, Ul aviv shalach kazot asarat chamorim neshoim mitov Mitzrayim ve'eser atonot nosot lechem aviv ladarech. And to their father he sent this: 10 donkeys laden with the goodness of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys laden with bread um, for their father along the way. Verse 24. Vayhi kelechet echav vayomer alehem al tirgezu badarech. And so it was, as they were going, when his brothers went, he said to them, um, do not, ragaz badarech. Okay, hold on. Um, forgot what this word means. Um, it's not here. The the word ragaz, blanking on its meaning. Hold up. So, um, okay, do not quarrel on the way. So ragaz means to quarrel. Um, let's go back there. Um, do not quarrel along the way. So they might run into some trouble. They should not get into a fight as they're going back to Canaan. Verse 25. Vaya'alu mimitzrayim, vayavohu eretz Knaan el Yaakov avihem. And they went up from Egypt, and they came to the land of Canaan to Jacob, their father. By the way, I want you to make note of something. Uh, like geographically, Egypt is thought of as below Canaan because when they're going from Egypt to Canaan, the verb vayal is used, which means they went up. Whereas when they're going from Egypt to, sorry, when they're going from Canaan to Egypt, they use the verb vayarad, which means to go down. So I don't know if, geographically Egypt is lower than Canaan, but it seems in the mind of uh, the um, the Hebrews, Egypt is below Canaan here, or lower than Canaan. Verse 26. Vaidabru lo lemor, od Yosef chai, v'chiku moshel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. Um, ויפג ליבו כי לא האמין להם. And they said to him, saying, or they spoke to him, saying, Joseph is still alive, and thus he is ruling in all the land of Egypt. And then it says here, and his heart became numb, that is to say, Jacob's heart, for he did not believe them. So He'emin here is the Hefil form of aman, to believe. We have not learned the Hefil stem yet, but here it's being introduced to us a little bit early. Verse 27. Vaidabru elav et kol dibre Yosef asher diber alehem, vayar et ha'agalot asher shalach Yosef lo, v'hi ruach Yaakov avihem. And they spoke to him all the words of Joseph which he spoke to them. So all the stuff that Jacob told his brothers to tell their father, he said them. They said it. And he saw the wagons which Joseph sent to him, and the spirit of Jacob, their father, was sort of made alive. So he was reinvigorated. In other words, And then one more verse. Vayomer Yisrael, Rav od Yosef bni Chai al elcha va'er'e oto b'terem amut. And Israel said, Great still is Joseph. Great. My son Joseph is still alive. I shall go. Notice the use of the cohortative here. And I will see. Let me go and see him before I die. You've got two cohortatives, elcha and er'e, and then this is just a simple imperfect, all in the first person singular. So we parsed a little bit more than I originally planned, but that's good because, you know, it helps you to familiarize yourself with all the different forms of the verb and how to identify them. Um, and look at that. We did everything in under an hour. So I hope that this has been instructive for you guys. Tune in next time where we will take up chapter 19, the PL, the Pual, and the Hitpael. So we're learning three new stems all at the same time next time.
Thank you so much for that, Lewis. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the time that you also put into preparing these lectures.
Hmm. Yeah, it's my pleasure. Always glad to be of service.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll see you guys next time. Hit that like button and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. See you later. God bless.